She truly believed just a few carefully chosen words, a well-placed complaint, would be enough to have a black man removed from first class. Just like that. With barely any effort. But then, with a calmness that almost felt rehearsed, he reached into his pocket and flashed his FBI badge. Patricia Langford walked briskly through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, her designer carry-on trailing behind her, gliding smoothly over the polished floor. She barely noticed the bustling crowds around her. She never did. Airports, to her, were just stepping stones between one destination and another, places she had navigated effortlessly for years. This particular flight route, Dallas to Washington, D.C., she had taken it so many times she could practically do it in her sleep. Always first class, of course. It was the only way she traveled. Anything less would be unthinkable. Everything about air travel felt predictable. The same routine every time. Priority boarding. A crisp glass of complimentary champagne placed delicately in her manicured hand. The hushed conversations of high-powered professionals discussing business deals in low, respectful tones. The scent of leather seats, the hum of the aircraft. It was all so familiar. And that's exactly how she liked it. So when she reached her row and spotted a black man already seated beside her, wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored navy blue suit, something inside her paused. Her steps faltered for just a second. He looked so at ease, confident, like he belonged. His laptop was open, fingers typing effortlessly, eyes scanning the screen with quiet focus, as though he were reviewing something of importance. The glow of the screen reflected subtly against his deep skin, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. He barely noticed her. And that did not sit well with Patricia. Her lips pressed together in a tight line as she set her designer tote down with just a little too much force, making a point without saying a word. She lowered herself into her seat, struggling to mask her irritation. First class wasn't supposed to be like this. Beside her, Daniel Stokes remained unfazed. He didn't acknowledge her arrival, didn't glance her way, didn't so much as twitch. He was absorbed in whatever work was on his screen, his composure calm, self-assured, as if he had taken this exact flight 100 times before. Patricia wasn't convinced. She inhaled sharply through her nose, sitting up a little straighter, shifting in her seat. Her purse nudged his armrest. A deliberate move? Perhaps. But he didn't react. Not even a glance. She glanced around instead, her gaze sweeping the cabin, expecting, no, waiting, for a flight attendant to notice this mistake. But no one did. So she took it a step further. Leaning slightly toward him, just enough to make her presence known, she finally spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carefully polite. Measured. Calculated. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Daniel didn't even look up. Yes. That was it. No elaboration. No explanation. No apology. Her fingers curled subtly against the edge of her armrest. That wasn't the answer she had expected. She cleared her throat, glancing around again, her gaze now landing on a flight attendant a few rows ahead, a young woman, Emily Jacobs, in her early 30s, busy assisting passengers. Patricia lifted her hand slightly, a subtle yet unmistakable gesture to summon her over. Beside her, Daniel sighed. It was small, but noticeable. Emily approached with a practiced smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Patricia let out a light chuckle, shaking her head as if the situation was amusing, but not really. "I think there's been a little mix-up," she said, tilting her head slightly, voice airy, casual, but with intent. "I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Emily's professional demeanor didn't waver. She glanced at Daniel, who finally, paused his typing. He lifted his gaze, meeting Emily's eyes, his face unreadable. Not surprised. Not confused. Something else. Emily pulled out her tablet, quickly checking the passenger manifest. It only took a second. "Actually," she said politely, "Mr. Stokes is in his correct seat. Your ticket says 2A, and he's in 2B. Silence. Patricia blinked. Her fingers tightened around her armrest. "That's odd," she said, forcing another light laugh. Are you sure? I just assumed. Emily's smile was still polite, but there was something in her expression, something that said she knew exactly where this was going. I'm sure, ma'am. Everything looks correct. Patricia's face barely twitched, but her carefully composed expression wavered for the briefest moment before she smoothed it over with another tight-lipped smile. Well, she exhaled, shifting slightly in her seat. I suppose mistakes happen. She turned toward the window. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Daniel, meanwhile, had already returned to his work. As if the entire exchange hadn't happened. Emily hesitated for half a second, sensing the tension. Then, with a brief nod, she stepped away. But Patricia was still stewing. Her fingers tapped against her knee. Her breath came in shallow, controlled inhales. Eyes darting toward the flight crew, then back to Daniel. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't explaining himself. He wasn't playing the game she expected him to play. That made her angrier. She wasn't the kind of woman to let things slide. And she wasn't about to start now. Patricia sat stiffly, arms crossed, her mind racing. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. She had flown first class for decades and never, not once, had she been put in a situation like this. The man beside her? He wasn't doing anything wrong. But that didn't matter. He didn't belong. Her breath came faster. Her irritation simmered. She couldn't just sit here and accept this. With a decisive movement, she pressed the call button. Overhead, a soft chime sounded. And just like that, she set everything in motion. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The words echoed in her mind, sharp and undeniable. Her pulse drummed in her ears. A steady, suffocating rhythm. But this is being taken completely out of context. Her voice wavered, but she pushed forward, clinging to the last fraying threads of control. If you'd just let me explain. The board disagrees. Flat. Final. No room for argument. His voice carried no sympathy, no hesitation. We'll issue a public statement by morning. We expect your resignation by then.
A sharp beep.
The call was over. Just like that. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the phone, the weight of reality crashing down on her. Her career? Over. Her reputation? Destroyed. And, the worst part? No one cared about her explanation. They had seen the video. The damning, undeniable footage. And the video was enough. Her name, her legacy, had been reduced to a headline. A viral clip. A cautionary tale. She let out a shaky breath, but it did nothing to steady her. This wasn't something she could fix. This wasn't a misunderstanding she could smooth over with the right connections, the right spin. This wasn't something being done to her. This was something she had done to herself.
And now?
She had to live with it. Meanwhile, Daniel Stokes? He hadn't spared her another thought. Not one. By now, he was probably in a boardroom somewhere, engaged in an important meeting.
Calm.
Focused. His life, completely untouched. Because for him, for Daniel Stokes, this had been just another Tuesday. Thought balloon if this story made you think. Backhand index pointing right. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, real-life scenarios.